when I took political philosophy decades ago and then taught it even a little bit decades ago, it seems to me we began with Plato and ended with Nietzsche. You've studied Heidegger and teach Heidegger. Why Heidegger?
Yeah.
Martin Heidegger, I should say. His full name, 20th century German
Yes.
philosopher.
I don't teach him in the introduction in the basic political philosophy courses because he's maybe too difficult and too remote. But he's really, I think, Heidegger, the most significant thinker of the 20th century. One thing that he is the teacher of other people, some of whom are in a way better known now. Hannah Arendt, Leo Strauss to a degree, Jacob Klein, who's the kind of prime mover of the St. John's Great Books program, Hans Gadamer, who's one of the chief authors, you might say, of certain kinds of literary criticism and philosophic criticism. He's also the ground of the existentialism, which used to be popular, Jean-Paul Sartre and so on. So one thing that makes Heidegger so important is that he's the source of much of the significant thinking after him, either following him or reacting to him, but also
Sometimes unacknowledged source, right? Deconstruction, all that French stuff, isn't that really Heidegger?
Sure,
I mean,
it's Heidegger.
The literary
and Heidegger's
criticism.
view of Nietzsche, a lot of it he's the unacknowledged source of. Sometimes he's acknowledged, but only half acknowledged. The complete reliance of many people on Heidegger is something they like to disguise. And at some point, they even probably forget. But he's fundamental in all those ways. Simply in terms of other thinkers, for, let's say, Strauss and Klein, he opened up a serious effort and ability to look again at Plato and Aristotle in their own terms. Heidegger taught lots of Aristotle in the early 1920s, so that's one reason he's significant. More fundamentally, he's of course significant because of what he himself did. His first great work, and really his greatest work, Being and Time, published in 1927, completed in 1926, is a radical new understanding of human being. And at the end of the day, how you understand human being is fundamental for your understanding of politics and political life. A deep new understanding of the meaning of moods and dispositions, a deep new understanding of everyday life and the importance of everyday life, a deep new understanding of understanding and reason itself. So a fundamental new view of human being, and beyond that, being as such, what reality is, really makes Heidegger, I think, the dominant thinker of the 20th century. And there's no one in this century so far who's within hailing distance either. Yeah.
So people should read your book on Heidegger's Being in Time, but if they, before they do that or after they do that, why don't you explain a little bit? I mean, what's...
Yes, they should certainly read my book, which we hope will be reissued soon. But there are other good books they could read too. What is this fundamental new understanding? Heidegger's view is that the central human characteristics can all be understood in terms of the way that how we are ourselves to be, what we are to make of ourselves, who we are. All the central human characteristics have to be understood in that light, that humans always stand out towards being itself, and in certain ways are the chief source of any kind of meaning. So,
as opposed to finding patterns out there,
as opposed to
something.
Simply seeing things outside. For instance, in order to understand what one understands technologically or scientifically, you first have to have things mean something to you in those terms, right? In order to deal with them technologically or in the laboratory, you first have to have things mean something to you in concrete scientific terms. It's the way that we are which first allows things to mean something to us, which is what's fundamental in us. And then things have their meaning such as it is. In Heidegger's case, the first and in a way easiest way to grasp this is through his analysis of the everyday workshop of using tools. You're making something. Things have a certain meaning to you in terms of the order in which things are to happen. This here, for that, for this purpose, for that end. And in order to deal with anything concretely in the everyday world, they first have to have that kind of meaning. In Heidegger's case, this is particularly important because it differentiates human everyday space and time from the kind of space and time that are central in the sciences. If you're making something, what's important is that it's close to you or far away, that you've lost it or found it, that it's nearby or not nearby. What's important is not that it's 6 feet away or 2 inches away. Space, time, all of those characteristics have an independent meaning in terms of the everyday world. And from that, you can see that we stand out into some understanding of meaning in anything we do. Another good example, you're in the mood or disposition of fear. Fear makes fearful and fearsome entities real to you in terms of the speed with which they approach, in terms of the place from which they come, in terms of the goals or the ends that you have. That's what fear and entities that you fear are. They can't be reduced to chemical reactions. They can't be reduced to scientific spaces and places and times. They can't be reduced to mere psychological effects. That's the reality of the moods that you have and what those moods are about. So Heidegger tried to work all this through in really trying to differentiate actual human experience from any reduction to science or physics or chemistry, but also from any inflation to the merely theoretical.
So to oversimplify, I'm sure, but a lot, I mean, on the one hand, he's not a scientific materialist, reductionist, matter and motion and atoms and so forth on the one hand, and on the other, not a, let's just use the term Platonic, though it's a caricature maybe, but, there are these ideas out there and one discovers them, right? I mean, somehow it's neither of those, I guess.
Right. It's in a certain sense closer to the way in which Aristotle tries to differentiate theoretical activity from practice, right? In Aristotle, you have this world that's kind of independent, at the end of the day, perhaps not in fact fully independent, so that you can talk about actual political virtue, the so-called mean, not too much, not too little, the virtue of generosity, don't give too much, nor be too cheap, and so on. And that has an independence from merely ultimately inflating it up to a certain kind of theoretical excellence. There's an independence in dealing with beautiful things that independent from simply understanding things theoretically. And Heidegger, in his own way, means to recapture, but then really separate that kind of practical or everyday activity. But ultimately, by doing that, he means to show that we are responsible, in a sense, for the meaning in terms of which any entity first comes to us and can be dealt with in any way whatsoever.
So this seems like a philosophic psychology or something, but why politics? I mean, what are the, how does it get to politics or?
Yeah, it's a philosophic psychology, but it's not meant to be simply in the head. It's meant to be in this in between, in the way in which we see things and the way in which they are. That's what we are. We're somehow in this in between. Why politics? Because part of what we seek to be and part of the world that surrounds us, which gives entities their meaning, is that it's public. The world around us is always a public world. It's also the case that central always is what we're ourselves for the sake of. What are our ends? What are our goals? In terms of which things then have a certain meaning. But our ends and goals and possibilities actually are not, in a certain sense, simply our own. They're given to us, again, by the history and tradition and world around us. So Heidegger says that basically what each of us is, in a certain sense, the they, the one, what one does, what we do, what they do, what we all do, how we see things. Any choice that you make is a choice ultimately in terms of a goal and for a purpose that you get from the world around you, that you understand from the world around you. Even when you seek to be individual and separate from it, you're seeking to be individual and separate in the same way everybody else seeks to be individual and separate.
You can't just weigh all the options sort of analytically and objectively. I mean,
Yeah, the options that you weigh are everybody else's options. So though everyone is at root individual, you are as an individual only in terms of a conception that you take from what's around you and that everyone else also has. When people used to talk of mass man, that is connected to this Heideggerian understanding. So it's political in those broad senses that we are essentially, in that sense, public or essentially the same as others at any time. But beneath that, we are somehow, of course, separate, because central for Heidegger always is the way in which you are yourself from beginning to end, and the end at the end of the day is death or dying. So that gives you a certain projection or understanding of that, gives you your separateness and individuality. Substantively, however, our views and judgments about ourselves are largely the same as everybody else's.
And does he then have a recommendation about regimes, liberal democracy or monarchy or whatever? I mean, where does this?
So Heidegger is one of those thinkers who likes to say that everything that he talks about is analytical, or you might say philosophical, and that he's not making any recommendations at all. And of course, Heidegger doesn't like talk in terms of value, because value is part of this misunderstanding of what human beings actually are. That said, Heidegger works out the difference between authenticity and inauthenticity. And lots of what used to be, and to some degree still is, popular talk about being authentic comes from Heidegger.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And to be authentic is ultimately to grasp what your own being is, to grasp yourself as standing within meaning and responsible for meaning, and in a certain sense responsible for the being or meaningfulness of everything. What will come of that is not so clear, because it always depends on the moment in which you stand and how you see things from that perspective. But there's also a kind of public or political analog to authenticity, so that you no longer see the public in this kind of ordinary way, but rather the public world around you central to your own possibilities, right? Central to the actions that you yourself take. When you are authentic, at the same time, therefore, somehow you illuminate the public as a people, as an authentic people, and a certain understanding of the people and your people becomes fundamental for him when he begins then to talk about politics. So authentic versus inauthentic, people versus public, that's the direction.
And authenticity is sort of, I don't know quite how to describe it. Is the highest good, or it's the highest, the most we can be? Is that?
He doesn't want, of course, call it the highest good. He doesn't want to say that it's something that you choose. It's impossible, however, to read Being and Time, where this is worked out, without wanting to be authentic rather than inauthentic. So whatever he says, that's clearly the direction. It's not so much the highest, it's the true understanding of what human beings actually are.
What you really are.
It's what you really are. And then what that then means concretely, depend so much on who you are and where you are. But it's that illumination that comes from seeing what we really are, as opposed to seeing ourselves as merely physical objects, as opposed to seeing ourselves merely as subjective actors, as opposed to seeing ourselves as merely bags of chemicals, as opposed to any of the other ways, but also as opposed to seeing ourselves as kind of incomplete objects who eventually want a kind of completion in a Platonic or Aristotelian or any other sense. It's to see that we are responsible for illuminating the meaning, in a way, of anything. That's what authenticity is, and that's why it has so little, you might say, substance.
But a sort of thrust against, I suppose, being a cog in a machine. It seems to be the two things that most people would know. I put myself in this category about Heidegger, or not know, but sort of vaguely glimpse about Heidegger as somehow a hostility to the modern technological worldview, the sense that we're just cogs in a machine and so forth. And then, of course, his notorious flirtation or more with Nazism and when it came to power in Germany. So maybe let's talk about both of those.
One of the things that Heidegger is known for is this radical understanding of technology. Radical in the sense that the first way in which we see and come to grips with everything now is technological. And by that he means we see everything as a resource for continued resourcefulness leading nowhere, seeing ourselves that way as well, human resources departments.
This is sort of the world of modern science. Or is it the world of all?
It's the world of everything. It's the world of everything. That is how we see and understand ourselves, and the kind of...
But I mean, have we always seen ourselves that way, or is that like a modern breakthrough?
For Heidegger, it's a modern understanding, though ultimately, for Heidegger, it goes back to Plato and Aristotle.
Kind of
Heidegger is one of those, like Nietzsche, who looks back even at the pre-Socratics, but even beyond that. So there's a connection to all rational understanding, but there's a deeper connection, of course, to modernity, Descartes, and so on. And what does it mean? It means we first have to see things as resources that can be rearranged, reassembled in any way in order to then discover what we discover in terms of concrete technology. What's important about technology, first of all, is not the concrete things that technology does. It's the first understanding of things so that they appear to us as capable of technological change. So they first appear to us in a way that mathematical physics can deal with them and recreate them. That's what's central. If we understand that that's what they are, we then are on a possible path to what one might say is authenticity, or the true understanding of ourselves, because we see that technology itself has meaning in terms of still a deeper meaning or being, and human meaning or being. Nonetheless, technology is now so dominant that it breaks down all forms, all independence, all ordinary life and activity. Everything is merely a source of energy. Everything is merely something which can be readjusted to bring about whatever you want. Everything loses its separate ends and separate independence. And the scientific concreteness of technology is just one version of that, but not what's fundamental in it. So that's part of human flattening, and ultimately, in a certain sense, the end of human beings, as Heidegger worries about it, I think.
Dehumanization, I guess.
Full dehumanization, even though. Full dehumanization in the sense that everything independent about us as human beings ultimately begins to wither because we increasingly simply see ourselves as material for manipulation.
Yeah, like human resources, human capital. I guess there's some
Yes,
truth to that, right?
That's right. That's what it is. We, as well as everything else, just material for manipulation. So it loses its form, loses its independence, loses its own desirability. Everything is just material for manipulation. And things approaching us so that they can be, and we ourselves approaching ourselves so that we are simply material for manipulation. That's what technology is.
But it needn't be that way,
It needn't be, because we are the beings who give meaning to things in the sense that things first approach us in a certain meaning. And who are we and what is being such that it is that way? Who are we and what are our characteristics such that we're responsible for anything first approaching us in any kind of meaning? If we can understand that that's who we are, there might be some recovery from this simple lostness in technology. What does that mean concretely in Heidegger? Again, it's always open, but among the things it means is a recovery of the everyday world, as we were saying, and its own independence, a recovery for Heidegger of a certain kind of piety or reverence, a recovery of art, poetry, and then more deeply a recovering of the true understanding of human emotions, human passions, human understanding. It could mean all of that, though to what end is, of course, not completely clear.
I suppose modern environmentalists, the deeper ones, were very much influenced by Heidegger, right?
Heidegger's had two major political effects. One is the connection with the Nazis, which we'll talk about.
Yes.
And the other is modern environmentalism, which is a kind of attempt to return to the separate independence of the environment around us.
Not just viewing it as stuff to be chopped down or
not just
used or turned into machine.
Not just viewing it as stuff to be chopped down, not just viewing the Rhine River as an energy source, not just viewing the material world in the ordinary sense, the trees to be chopped down and simply used. And Heidegger is one of the sources of that kind of understanding. He himself, I think, would not want to be so concrete about it, because a concrete environmentalist is also going to wind up to be essentially technological.
Because you just want to preserve the forest, so it's something for you to enjoy looking at, but in a way that's also instrumental, right?
Exactly right. It's the tourist industry of looking at the environment. It's the tourist industry of an African safari. That's what it is. You're not actually, you're still using it in the wrong kind of senses. So Heidegger, in his own thinking and talking, is very pure about all of that. But then if you're looking for something that's a kind of concrete effect, environmentalism of a certain sort is one of those concrete effects.
And we'll get to the Nazis in a minute, but is reason, I mean, what about, is there a kind of irrationalism or arationalism or anti-rationalism? And Heidegger, again, in the kind of conventional, very view, it's sort of Nietzsche, Heidegger, they're relativists, they challenge reason. There's not the opposite of the ancients, and in a way the opposite of the early moderns, who in a different way elevate reason or rationalism.
Heidegger thinks of himself as not a relativist and not a historicist in any of those ordinary ways. Why? Because relativism is simply the opposite side of absolutism, and he believes his own thought to be beyond that or somehow in another place or in another area. The use of reason is, again, dependent on first having things have a certain meaning in a certain way, right? So rational understanding or rational calculation is always in terms of something or other. And again, what we are, first of all, is the ones who first illuminate or bring out those terms, so to speak, those first terms of meaning. That's other than and beyond any ordinary relativism or absolutism, either side of it, so he would say. That said, however, to be in that world in which you first give a certain kind of meaning is very much connected to an historical understanding of the particular place you are, the particular tradition that you inherit, but that you need to understand in a certain way. So Heidegger likes to understand the being of things as not dependent on their being forever or their being eternal. And the meaning and attraction of things as not being eternal and forever. So in those ways, one might call him a relativist, but again, as he understands it, that whole way of talking is a level removed from where his own understanding seeks to be.
Any preceding thinkers have a particularly large influence on Heidegger, or would he himself acknowledge any
I think the chief
his
influence,
debt to any particular thinker?
yeah, the chief is Aristotle.
More than Nietzsche? Or,
Yeah, Heidegger says, that you should study Aristotle for 10 or 15 years before you proceed in any other way.
Wow.
Which maybe comes as a surprise to
Yeah,
people,
he
given the
seems like the
conventional.
opposite, right?
Yeah,
So,
of course. But that's what he spent a lot of time studying early on, because he understands Aristotle to be the fullest grasp of what the Greeks sought, of the Greek understanding of nature, of the philosophic understanding of motion and movement, all of these things which was so important to him. Kant, a very important influence as well. Nietzsche, somewhat less so. And of course, most directly, Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, because when you read Heidegger, you see that it's essentially a kind of phenomenological approach to things, describing things just as they are. That's part of not reducing or inflating, but talking about things just as they are, and that all of the things you take for granted that surround them in order for those things to be just as they are. Hence the example of using tools. Your implicit understanding that this is for that, it's in an order of involvement, an order of functions, your implicit understanding of, you might say, everyday meaningful space and time as opposed to merely calculated space and time. So Husserl, of course, is in a way the single dominant influence. So let's say if one needs to list three: Husserl, Aristotle, and Kant.
And many people watching this might have been taught by students of Leo Strauss, or students of students of students of Leo Strauss at this point, or have read Strauss. Strauss himself says, I think, somewhere that Heidegger had an enormous impact on him as a young man, and he then moves away or turns away or goes beyond, however one wants to say it. But talk a little bit about both his influence on Strauss directly, but maybe more importantly, the kind of, from a theoretical point of view, the relationship of the two.
Yeah, Heidegger, Strauss attended a course or two of Heidegger's on Aristotle. Wasn't part of the group around Heidegger, perhaps as immediately as his friends Gadamer and Jacob Klein, or later Hans Jonas, a little bit later, and Hannah Arendt, or a year or two earlier, Carl Lewith, a name I hadn't mentioned, all of these significant names. But of course, he was part of that whole circle and group. Similarly, his close friend Kojève, the great French thinker. So Strauss was part of the circle, but at a little bit removed part of the circle surrounding Heidegger, and he studied a thing or two with him. Strauss also studied with Husserl. What's the influence? First of all, I think it is this phenomenological influence, to look at things simply as they are and what you take for granted and understanding them, as opposed to a scientific or even social scientific approach, as opposed, let's say, to Weber. Heidegger also had an enormous influence on certain kinds of religious thinking, especially Protestant thinking, and part of that whole new world of looking at religion that Strauss both learned from and, in a way, rebelled against, very much influenced by Heidegger.
So Rosenzweig and Karl Barth and
Rosenzweig and Rudolf Bultmann in particular, maybe those two. But most of all, I would say, is that Heidegger opened up the possibility of seeing Aristotle just as Aristotle was, apart from the usual way of understanding Aristotle, which by then had become encrusted with kind of the Catholic or religious understanding of him, and of Plato as well. When you look at what are now published as the transcripts of Heidegger's courses in the 1920s, there's a wonderful direct look at and understanding of Aristotle, and a wonderful, essentially, commentary on Plato's dialogue, The Sophist. So all of that, directly in some cases and indirectly, had an enormous influence on Strauss and all those around Strauss as well. But that's as a first step. And then one can look at Plato and Aristotle on their own and be attracted to their understanding simply, not to the way in which Heidegger came to see them.
But he broke through both the kind of, let's call it the religious understanding of Aristotle, but also a kind of historicist, I suppose, relegation of Plato and Aristotle to a mere step in thinking that had been transcended or moved beyond.
And the other thing that he did is to try to recapture the basic experiences from which the thought emerged. You know, what happens is that the concepts of thinkers take on a life of their own. They have a whole scholarship connected to them.
Right.
They become kind of words. No one really knows what they mean. Heidegger always sought to recapture the basic understanding, what it was the thinker was really looking at and seeing, from which the concepts and the judgments emerged, so that by opening all that up, he took away the mere playing with the concepts or what had seemed to become the self-evidence for good or ill of the conceptual understanding in Aristotle and other thinkers as well. So not just the religious incrustation and not just the usual traditional attention and inattention, but even the serious attempts to look at Aristotle or any other thinker, nonetheless never get down to, and still don't, of course, usually get down to, what it is they're really talking about, what it is these concepts and ideas are truly trying to bring out, judge, and express. Heidegger is the chief figure, I think, in making that possible.
And you would recommend still that one could, I mean, these are intelligible, these courses on Aristotle, one could read in German or read the translations in English? I mean, you would recommend that?
Yes, they're intelligible. All of them are intelligible, but difficult. But I would certainly recommend them. There are, a few of them. One good thing is the work on Plato's Sophists, which, however, begins with a very, very long section on Book 6 of Aristotle's Ethics. That's one good thing to look at. And then the first couple of courses he taught on Aristotle, because you have all of the energy and excitement of discovering a new world together with him. He's discovering, in a certain sense, a new world, too. So,
and he's actually teaching, right? So these are actual students. I mean,
and he's
just
actually
like students today.
And he's actually teaching. So all of that is remarkable. There's also the very first course he taught after the war, that had a special semester after the First World War. Part of that course gives you a broader sense of the excitement that Heidegger brought to all the students around him. At a certain point in the course, he comes in and discusses and analyzes the actual experience of approaching the lectern, seeing the students in the room, brings that all to life in its separate, independent meaning, again, with no reduction or inflation of it to something else, in this remarkable way, and shows you why it's philosophically important, ultimately shows you why it's philosophically important, because it's such a clue to what human beings are and how to understand all our characteristics and what being is generally. So I would recommend those things.
Yeah, that one, maybe I'll try to read that. That sounds great. So let's talk about the Nazi regime and Heidegger, kind of notorious, affiliation with it for a while. And
yeah, and that's the reason why people sometimes would not want to recommend Heidegger. Why am I recommending this thinker who sets me on the road to perdition, because of what's more than an association with the Nazis? Well, there's a serious association with the Nazis, and one needs to take that very, very seriously in reading Heidegger. But he understands so much that one needs to take that seriously as well, and basically attempt to recapture what's reasonable and sensible and deep in Heidegger, but see if one can put it on some other plane. The Nazis themselves. Heidegger became rector, head of his university in Freiburg, which is a political appointment, in 33, and then into 1934. So really became, in a certain sense, an official. Connected to that, become a member of the party, resigned the rectorate after 10 months, but not his party membership, and remained close to and friendly with lots of the intellectual circles surrounding the Nazis, though he had his objections to them as well. So not just sort of intellectually and verbally, but in those concrete ways. Heidegger also published various short pieces in support of various of Hitler's actions, seemed to agree with a kind of coordination of all the institutions in Germany so that they lost their independence and separateness, and was part of, in his own ways, the attack on Jews. So there's a real association with the Nazis.
Not just the kind of normal, if I can say, cowardly not standing up to the Nazis, which there was quite a lot of.
That's right.
Cowardly is unfair, even given the threats, but anyway, the not standing up to the Nazis, more than that, a kind of affirmation of something.
That's right. It's a lot more than just that. Maybe there was some element of that in it, hard to say, but there was a lot more than that. And then after the war, he never repented, never took it back. And indeed, in one notorious statement, more or less compared the death camps to mechanized agriculture, because it's all technological. So there's a certain real ugliness. What's come to light more recently are the seminars that he taught from, let's say, 1933 to 1935, of which there are reports and protocols. The Germans would often do summaries of these things, which he accepted as real, which are much more deeply and concretely attacks on Jews, attacks on enemies of the people, discussions of why nomadic groups could not actually be part of people, a kind of undergirding of this usual ideological business of rootless cosmopolitanism, not his words as such, but especially that kind of rootlessness. So there's a real and serious and ugly association, and a lot of it comes from his thought. It's not an accident. It's not as if he somehow doesn't understand himself. That's what people sometimes used to want to say. And it's not as if he's naive, and therefore, he has these views of someone who grew up as kind of in some vague German small town, small village environment. No, you could see, if you were serious, that an association with the Nazis was always possible. People at one point saw it, then they stopped seeing it, then they saw it again. At the time I wrote my book on Heidegger, it's published in 1981, we were in an ebb where people like to pretend that none of this meant anything. If you go through Being in Time, you can see the connection. As more and more it's come out, people can't deny it simply. What they then try to deny is a real connection to the thought in a deep way. That's harder to deny as well now. And the reason is that you are always connected to the people and the people around you, and the people's somehow immersion within true being and true understanding is an act of decision, an act of will to a degree. His understanding is very opposed to liberal democracy. From his point of view, Soviet Union, America, it's all the same. So this deep illiberalism, I think, is the real problem and the real difficulty. He wouldn't be a Nazi in every circumstance, of course, because it's not that kind of thing, but it's altogether clear why I think he became one and had these inflated expectations of what he could do and of what the Nazis could do, to return us to a truer, in a way more authentic ground, but that brought with it this kind of Germanic exclusivity to a degree, certainly in relation to the Jews and others, and a certain expansion too, not global expansion, but nonetheless expansion. All of this comes out a little more clearly recently than had been the case. So it's a real difficulty and a real issue, and it leads you necessarily to ask, again, as I said, can you recapture what seems to be true in Heidegger, but in another way? Or does it necessarily lead in this direction?
I suppose what's deep is the illiberalism, or let's even say the anti-modern industrial liberal democracies side. It could have, if it hadn't been a Nazi regime, that it could have been just a more normal, you might say,
could have been, right,
anti-liberal regime that he might have also liked, I suppose. So maybe he was attracted to the radicalism of the Nazis.
Well, he's attracted, I think,
extremism in a way.
Yeah, I think to two things. One is he's attracted to the kind of holistic nature of it, the total nature of it. From Heidegger's standpoint, the meaning of everything is connected to this particular people at this particular time. So all of the ways in which in liberalism the state or the country doesn't completely control anything disappear, not just our individual rights, but also the sense in which there's a cosmopolitanism of art, right, of thought, of science, of music.
Countercurrents going on.
Right. It never reduces itself to this complete total nature. That is not how Heidegger understood the way in which you understood those kinds of possibilities of art, culture, labor, or anything else. Those possibilities were always somehow connected to the people, to, you might say, the they self to begin with, as we had mentioned, and then to it as it's understood more broadly. So the grounds of differentiation didn't exist. And those grounds separate you from too much attachment to this people, but those grounds also give you some caution about what you yourself might do and about the relationship between philosophy and politics, so that the deep split always, whatever the connections between the philosophic and the political way of life that you'll see in Plato or ultimately even in Aristotle, you don't see so clearly in Heidegger, because it all somehow, as he saw it then, came together. Also the radicalism, as you said, because you must have a radical stance in a certain sense if you so much think that we have lost our roots in everything real. You're looking to see if there's something that can return us to those roots. Later, he becomes less attached politically to that kind of possibility, but he's still looking for it always. And when he saw something that looked a little bit useful politically, he would reattach himself to it. He was a partisan, in a way, of the German student left, not the terrorist left, but that radical left in the 60s as well. So there was always this kind of radicalism connected, yes, to the illiberalism.
Interesting. Just to finish up, to read, the lectures on Aristotle you mentioned, Being in Time, I guess the great work, but not easy. Made easier by your excellent commentary. But these famous, are there other 2 or 3 essays you'd recommend, or short books?
Yes, my book, Bill, and anything I've ever written on Heidegger.
Yes, other essays on Heidegger. Right.
So you have to read Being in Time, because that's the full discussion of human being. And a lot of the other things afterwards in Heidegger discuss being as such, discuss other philosophers, discuss other thinkers in an extremely deep and illuminating way. But the original power comes from this radical understanding of human being and what we are. And that's really worked out most completely in Being in Time. So I don't think you can avoid.
Okay, well,
I don't think you can avoid Being in Time.
You can't just read on technology. What's it called? Essay on technology.
The essay on technology is something.
Humanism, isn't there that?
Yeah, that's a very tough one. So I would go. You could read the essay on technology. The other thing I'd recommend is if you think you know or want to learn something about any particular thinker, you want to read what Heidegger has to say about that. A second big book to read is his essays on Nietzsche. He gave a lot of courses on Nietzsche in the 30s up through the early 40s, published by him in 1961. And a lot of that is very illuminating in terms of both Heidegger himself and his understanding of the history of philosophy and other thinkers. So I'd recommend the Nietzsche book. I'd recommend the technology essay. I'd recommend particular essays on particular thinkers, the courses on Aristotle, but most of all, still Being in Time, to truly understand his understanding of human being, and also part of what it is that made him so attractive to these brilliant students that he had, and made him almost immediately an international phenomenon in the intellectual world. You have to look at Being in Time to see that, I think.
Okay, look at Being in Time.
Good.
We'll close on that note.
Good.
Thank you, Mark.
Sure, you're welcome, Bill.